Peter Acey, Anzac Day Precinct and Brisbane World War II History YouTube channel, and this footage is an introduction to a very special podcast, as the podcast itself is a summation of some of the major speeches that were made at the Battle for Australia Memorial, which is now held in the Chermside Heritage Precinct right next to the Milne Bay Research Library. It is an incredible summation.
Representing the Premier, Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Public Sector, Mr Bart Mellish MP. Representing the Leader of the Opposition, the Member for Clayfield, Mr Tim Nichols MP. Representing the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, Councillor for Marcham, Councillor Fiona Hammond. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys. I would like to start by acknowledging the original custodians of the lands Brisbane is on, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular because of today and its meaning, for any servicemen or women from our First Nations people who have served in the past or are currently serving. It is an honour and a privilege for me to be able to be here today to be part of this very important commemorative service on the 81st anniversary of the Battle for Australia commemoration service. As Australians, I believe we feel very strongly and deeply connected to the incredible courage, resilience and sacrifice shown by countless of our armed forces during the many battles of the Pacific during World War II.
In January of this year, he assumed command of HMAS Moreton, and as such is currently the Senior Naval Representative, South East Queensland. Would you please welcome Commander Gerald Savakis, RAN-ADC.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. His Excellency, the Honourable Paul de Jersey, AC, and Mrs de Jersey, the Honourable Federal Member for Lilly, Miss Annika Wells, MP. Well, in 1942 is a significant year for our nation's history, and the only year in which Australians, together with our allies, fought in direct defence of continental Australia. Today, we pause for a few moments to honour the courage, sacrifice and service of our members who fought and repelled the Japanese attack on Australia in 1942. We also give thanks and pay our respects to those civilians who risked their lives and died defending Australia and our homeland. The period between November 1941 and February 1942 were disastrous months for Australia and her allies. HMAS Sydney was lost to the German raider mine layer the Cormoran, with the loss of 645 hands. In the Far East, the Royal Navy British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk. Hong Kong fell, and Malaya was invaded in December. Singapore also surrendered on the 15th of February in 1942, resulting in the imprisonment of approximately 100,000 British, Indian and Australian troops, including a large portion of the 8th Division of the AIF. Faced with a strategic disaster of a first magnitude, then Prime Minister Curtin would warn of what he foresaw in the weeks ahead, calling it a looming battle for Australia. While there were many sacrifices made during this period, I will today only mention a few of the many events that occurred during this tumultuous year. A year in which Australians and their allies desperately defended this nation, both at home and beyond our shores. Today, we remember the 65 Australian Army nurses who were ordered to escape Singapore in the merchant ship the SS Vinabrook, but which were subsequently captured by Japanese forces after the ship was sunk by Japanese aircraft. 21 of those individuals were murdered by machine gun fire on the beach at Banker Island, while 8 of the remaining 32 women died as prisoners of war due to starvation, neglect and lack of medical care. Of those captured, only 24 of those brave women returned from captivity to Australia after the war. Today we remember the destruction of Darwin on the 19th of February by 188 Japanese carrier-borne aircraft and a substantial figure of more land-based bombers, which killed approximately 235 Australians, both service and civilian. 30 Allied aircraft were destroyed, including 9 of the 10 defending Darwin. 9 ships in the harbour and 2 at sea nearby were sunk. We remember the Clemson-class destroyer USS Peary, which was at anchor in Darwin Harbour, having narrowly escaped being sunk off Java. Peary suffered grievously before she sank with 88 sailors killed in action. She kept firing at the Japanese bombers while herself ablaze and while her ammunition was exploding. We remember the corvettes of the RAN, which were in Darwin Harbour and under air attack. HMAS Deloraine came to the rescue and saved many lives of sailors that day, while HMAS Katoomba, high and dry in the floating dock, took the fight to the Japanese attackers with her sailors and every gun and rifle firing the continuing wave of attacking bombers. The air raids went on. On the 3rd of March, the isolated and undefended town of Broome was attacked. 88 civilians were killed, and many of them being Dutch women and children who had escaped via flying boat from their homes in Java, hoping for safety in Australia. More than 60 air raids were made on Darwin, Broome and Wyndham, Thursday Island and Townsville over the next 2 years.
Assumed command of HMAS Morton and the Senior Naval Officer of South East Queensland. Representing the Chief of Navy, would you please welcome Commander Fiona Southwood, RAN.
Wow, sounds like a lot when you hear it like that. Thank you for that warm welcome. Good morning, Your Excellency, Professor Nemo, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and most especially military veterans from both our country and those of our allies. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to deliver this address to you on behalf of Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, our Chief of Navy, who sends his apologies that his duties have prevented him from being here in person today. It's a privilege to remember with you the events of particularly 1942, the only year in our national history when Australians fought alongside our allies in direct defence of continental Australia, hopefully something we will not see again. We remember the loss of HMAS Perth and the USS Houston in the Battle of the Sunda Strait, the only survivors of the Battle of the Java Sea, the loss of HMAS Yarra, the loss of our merchant seamen that assisted under a red ensign. Indeed, General Douglas MacArthur said of ships and the men of the Allied merchant navies and their performance, particularly in 1942, they brought us our lifeblood and they paid for it with their own. I saw them bombed in New Guinea's ports when it was humanly possible, when their ships were not blown out from under them by bombs or torpedoes. They delivered their cargoes to us that needed them so badly. The efficiency and the courage they displayed marked their conduct throughout the entire campaign in the Southwest Pacific area. They have contributed tremendously to our success, and I hold no branch in higher esteem than the merchant marines. We also remember the Battle of New Guinea, the loss of the Australian hospital ship Centaur, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the convoy to reinforce the New Guinea offensive, the efforts of our Navy codebreakers, both in Melbourne and overseas from Washington, and the efforts of our Allied forces, which ultimately ended in the defeat of our enemy on the land, sea and air north of Australia. In 1943, while the enemy's unconditional surrender was still far off, and much more blood, sweat and tears would be shed in the pursuit of victory, it was the events in the defence of Australia which checked and ultimately defeated the advance of the enemy in the Pacific. We remember those who suffered in prisoner of war camps and those that were liberated and returned home. Those that contributed to this battle for Australia, very few now, we cherish and respect. We honour the courage and tenacity of those who died fighting in the jungles of New Guinea and in its surrounding skies and seas. A maritime campaign that began at sea and was sustained by the sea. We remember all those in the ships sunk off our shores, especially Australia's merchant seamen, torpedoed and mined off on the east coast while they were carrying supplies north.
He is head of the Corps of Royal Australian Engineers. Would you please welcome Brigadier Michael Say, DSC.
Good morning, Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and the students from the schools represented here today. And a special mention to the military veterans from all countries represented here today, in particular recognition of your service and contribution to the defence of the nation. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to deliver this address, which is an important medium to remember the service of those Australians and our allies who played a crucial role in the direct defence of continental Australia during World War II. This includes the civilians who risked their lives and died defending our country. Their courage, sacrifice and service was an example for us all. I turned to 1942 and the formidable Japanese military had conquered swathes of territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Prime Minister John Curtin told the country on the 16th of February 1942 that the fall of Singapore opens the Battle of Australia. Despite the defeat at the Battle of Midway, Japan remained a potent enemy committed to the creation of a defensive arc to shield its captured possessions in the Pacific. What eventuated was a wide range of battles ranging across the land, sea and air. There are too many to mention individually, so as an Army officer and commander of the 7th Brigade, I will initially focus on the Battle of Milne Bay. Milne Bay has often been described as a swamp-riddled haven for malaria and cursed with torrential rain. General Douglas MacArthur had ordered the secret construction of an Allied base with airfields to protect the maritime approach to Port Moresby. But the Japanese soon discovered the base of Milne Bay and detached a task force to destroy the garrison and occupy the base. All that stood between the Japanese and their prize was a brigade of regular soldiers, untrained in tropical warfare, the 18th Brigade, and a brigade of Australian militia with no combat experience, the 7th Brigade. Despite this, they prevailed, with Field Marshal Sir William Slim stating, Australian troops had, at Milne Bay, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. Some of us may forget that, of all the Allies, it was Australians who first broke the invincibility of the Japanese army. The battle for Australia was not solely a land domain. It was a concentrated effort from the services and civilians of our nation. We remember the contributions of the Air Force, clearly evident at Milne Bay, where 75 and 76 Squadron countered Japanese aircraft, and Air Force personnel were embedded in Milne Force headquarters to coordinate joint operations. Some would say laying the foundation for the joint approach the Defence Force has of today. We also remember the significant contribution of the Navy, in particular all whose ships were sunk off our shores, Australia's merchant seamen who confronted waters with the threat of mines and submarines to transport war supplies to the troops fighting in our north. The Coast Watchers who bravely stayed behind enemy lines and with the help of the New Guinea natives were able to send back radio messages on the movement of Japanese aircraft and naval vessels.
He has 5,000 hours flying experience and holds an airline transport pilot's licence, a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Master of Arts in Strategy and Management. Would you please welcome Group Captain Dennis Tan.
Thank you for a lovely introduction. First, could I acknowledge that today we meet on terrible country? I'd acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and certainly extend that acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who are here today, And could I pay a particular acknowledgement to those men and women who have served Australia in times of peace and war. If I could further extend that acknowledgement then to all serving ADF personnel and veterans that are here today. Thank you so much for coming. Patrick O'Keefe has made a lovely acknowledgement of all our distinguished and VIP guests here today, so I won't continue and repeat those acknowledgements. But could I make one special acknowledgement, and that is to Mr. Patrick O'Keefe, OAM, who's the President of the Battle for Australia Commemoration Committee. Thank you to you and the committee for helping us to remember important events such as the Battle for Australia. This is the 25th consecutive service conducted by this organisation, and Pat has led that since its inception in the year 2000. This is Patrick's last service as President. Pat, thank you for a magnificent contribution to our understanding of Australia's military history. We remember the Battle for Australia on the first Wednesday of September each year. 2024 is the 82nd anniversary. We remember those who fought on the Australian mainland and in the sea, land and air battles in our near region. Their efforts contributed substantially to the defeat of Japan. The Battle for Australia wasn't one battle, it wasn't one event, and nor was it fought in a single location. It wasn't a single time period and spans events from 1942 to 1945. The region in which we operated would today be known as the Indo-Pacific region and remains our main area of strategic focus on this very day. Events in the Battle for Australia were intended to halt or disrupt the southward advancement of the Japanese Imperial Army. I'd acknowledge too that it was only a couple of weeks ago that we celebrated Victory in the Pacific Day, VP Day, which is on the 15th of August. And that was a day after Japan had unconditionally surrendered on the 14th of August, 1945. A little bit of World War II history, and there's a lot of World War II history, but I'll start by saying World War II wasn't a single war. It was multiple simultaneous wars across the globe, a two-ocean war. To go further back, it was at the end of World War I on the 28th of June 1919 that the Treaty of Versailles was signed. That left Germany bitter, weakened and impoverished. So there was a need for the rebuilding of German nationalism and industrialism, and this led to the rise in the popularity of Adolf Hitler from 1919 onwards, who along with the Nazi Party was democratically elected by the people of Germany. Germany grew rapidly as an industrial power and was hungry for resources. From 1938 onwards, Germany invaded many countries: Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece and Russia. Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 in response to the invasion of Poland. And France fell very quickly, which led to the Battle of Dunkirk on the 26th of May 1940 and the evacuation of British and Allied forces from France. So Great Britain was on her own and relied very heavily on Australia's and others for support. Winston Churchill's greatest desire was that America entered the war, and they sure did on the 7th of December 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Australians fought in Great Britain, Europe, the Middle East and North Africa through to the end of World War II. And although we're here today to acknowledge the Battle for Australia, we'll never forget the stories and sacrifices of our sailors, soldiers, airmen and nurses who fought in the Atlantic, European, Middle Eastern and North Africa theatres, lest we forget. The reason I give that context is because it explains why there was often a scarcity of resources or poor preparations for events in the Battle for Australia, which didn't commence until February 1942 when Singapore fell to the Japanese. By that point, Australia had been committed to war in the Northern Hemisphere for nearly 3 years. A couple of quick examples. The 6th and 7th Australian Imperial Force AIF divisions were returned to Australia on the 1st of April 1942, having fought in the Middle East. And by September, those same troops were fighting the Japanese on the Kokoda Trail. If we think about the tragedies in Bomber Command over Europe, where over 4,000 Australians lost their lives, they are stories all within themselves. So Australia fought 2 wars in World War II, one in Europe against Germany and one in the Pacific against Japan. Remember that Germany and Japan were allies in World War II under the Tripartite Pact of the 27th of September 1940. But even though their objectives were related and overlapping, they were of little practical use to each other, given the vast distances between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Another key piece of context is the Second Sino-Japanese War, which commenced in 1937 between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. The war is also considered to be part of World War II, and along with other titles is known as the Asian Holocaust. It started with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and one of the very terrible events of that war was known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, which saw somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000 deaths. And the imprecise number of deaths in itself I find both disturbing and staggering. In December 1941, the Japanese army had 2.4 million men, backed by over 3 million reservists. They were hardened by the tough campaigns in Manchuria and China. The individual was schooled to subordinate himself to the public good. Ultimate loyalty was to the emperor. Failure in duty or capture was considered a shame and disgrace to the family of the soldier, and the highest honours were bestowed upon those who fell in battle. The reason I give this context is because it explains why Japan was such a dangerous and vicious and determined adversary, hard to defeat. I want to acknowledge today as well that Japan and Germany are very good friends to Australia, and it was only just a couple of weeks ago I sat with officers from both those countries in a much larger coalition in a planning conference at Enoggera Barracks as we plan for a big exercise next year called Talisman Sabre. The friendships and the warmth between us all was very positive. So our remembrance of the battle for Australia today helps us to never forget a very significant series of battles and events. It's important that we never forget the 15th of February 1942 when Singapore fell to the Japanese. Prime Minister John Curtin likened the fall of Singapore to the Battle of Dunkirk, in that Dunkirk was the beginning of the Battle of Britain, and so too Singapore was the beginning of the battle for Australia. In a single week of fighting on Singapore Island, more than 880 Australians were killed. There were more dead than wounded. 130,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner. 15,000 Australians from the 8th Division remained as prisoners of war until the end of World War II, and many were sent to the Thai-Burma Railway, and many didn't survive. The advance of the Japanese forces down the Malayan Peninsula is a truly remarkable story. So too, it's remarkable that the failures of leadership from General Officer Commanding Lieutenant General Arthur Percival and other senior leaders is absolutely noteworthy, and not in a good way. Percival was to sign the largest surrender of forces ever in British history. Let's never forget one day after, on the 16th of February 1942, the Banker Island Massacre, where 21 Australian Army nurses and 60 British and Australian soldiers were killed by the Imperial Japanese Army on Raji Beach in the Dutch East Indies, now known today as Indonesia. 65 Australian Army nurses were evacuated out of Singapore as it fell on a ship called the Viner Brook, and it was bombed and sunk. 22 survived the swim to shore on Banker Island and surrendered as prisoners of war. They were marched into the surf and machine gunned from behind. One survived. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkle, and her story is absolutely remarkable and deeply compelling. Let's never forget on the 19th of February 1942 when Darwin was bombed. It merely had a population of 2,000 people at the time, and 188 Japanese aircraft attacked that town and over 250 people were killed. The attacks continued in 1942 and 1943, and by November 1943, the towns of Port Hedland, Derby, Katherine, Horn Island and Townsville had all been attacked, not to mention the hundreds and hundreds of ships that have been sunk along the Australian coastline. We need to also remember the Battle of the Java Sea, 27th of February 1942, when HMAS Perth was badly damaged and sunk on the 1st of March. 353 sailors lost their lives. The 328 who survived were sent to the Thai-Burma Railway, and only 214 lived to be repatriated to Australia at the end of the war. How could we forget the Battle of the Coral Sea between the 4th and 8th of May 1942, known as the battle that saved Australia. And it was the largest ever naval battle fought off Australian shores. In early May 1942, an American carrier force intercepted a Japanese carrier force in the Coral Sea, and after a fierce aerial battle, the Japanese turned back. 3 US ships and 15 Japanese ships were sunk. Simultaneously, in the north, HMAS Hobart and HMAS Australia were part of a task force sent to intercept a Japanese invasion fleet heading for Port Moresby. The force was attacked, but because of actions in the Coral Sea, that invasion fleet turned back. These were the first major setbacks to the Japanese during their advance south, and it broke a mindset that the Japanese were unstoppable. If Port Moresby had fallen to the Japanese, that would have certainly put Australia under serious threat. And it wasn't the last time the Japanese would attempt to take Moresby. We could talk about the battle for Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal, all that had factors in our later success to drive the Japanese out of Papua and New Guinea. Let's also remember the 31st of May and the 1st of June 1942, when Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbour. They sunk via torpedo attack the requisitioned Sydney Harbour ferry, HMAS Cuttable, and 19 Australians and 2 British sailors were killed. 6 months later, the naval depot at Garden Island was recommissioned HMAS Cuttable and remains named so to this day, so that we can perpetuate the memory of those 21 men killed during that attack. That attack was a huge wake-up call to Sydney-siders and Australians in general, who up until that point had regarded the war as being off in the distance. The Kokoda campaign marks the course of one of the most important battles for Australians in the Second World War. There are stories of incredible hardship for soldiers from both sides, and they're really captivating. 21st July, 16th of November 1942 were battles where Australians halted the furthermost southward advance by Japanese forces in Papua and then pushed the enemy back across the Owen Stanley Range. Let's remember that Papuan and New Guinean men were employed as carriers and assisted in evacuating the seriously wounded and sick troops to safety, sometimes under fire. More than 150 of those men were killed. Their compassion and care for the casualties earned them the admiration and respect from Australians, who dubbed those men the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. 625 Australians died, 1,600 were wounded in the 4 months of fighting in the vicinity of the Kokoda tracks, and casualties exceeded 4,000 from sickness. Let's always remember the sinking of the HMAS Armidale off the coast of New Guinea, within a few miles of the Australian coastline on the 1st of December 1942. 100 Australian and Dutch sailors were killed. It's significant for all Australians that on the 1st of December 2020, Ordinary Seaman Teddy Sheehan was posthumously and belatedly awarded a Victoria Cross for his final actions aboard Armidale at just 18 years of age. Australian personnel played key roles in Milne Bay, Boona, Gona, Sanandanda, Wau, the Huon Peninsula, Wewak and Bougainville. Southward advancement of the Japanese Imperial Army was eventually halted. So my reflections. Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz wrote in his book On War, that was first published in 1832, that war is a clash between major interests that is resolved by bloodshed. This could not have been more true of the largest, bloodiest and most expensive war in history, World War II, in which some 50 to 70 million lives were lost. Australia suffered over 40,000 service deaths in World War II, mostly in Asia and the Pacific. More were wounded in action, and some 22,000 Australians became prisoners of war, and of whom about 8,000 lost their lives. So what does this mean for the future? Well, I would contend that the nature of war, as described by Clausewitz, will never change. It will always be a violent clash of opposing wills in order to achieve a political objective. The character of war, however, will change. There are new technologies, tactics, enemies, and narratives emerging all the time. So our political and military leaders should never consider that there's an easy and non-violent way to wage war. It's always going to be a horrible business. Enduring themes of warfare like the political objective, logistics, geography and leadership were as relevant in World War II as they are to this day. The ADF values that we hold today of service, courage, respect, integrity and excellence are as important today as they were for our forebears in the battle for Australia. So a final word to conclude. The Defence Force is an instrument of national power. It's an instrument of government. We're here to serve the government of the day. Service in the Australian Defence Force means you've written a blank cheque or entered into a contract with potentially unlimited liability to the government and the people of Australia. That blank cheque was cashed for many Australians in World War II when their lives were lost. The responsibility on our political and military leadership when the ADF is utilised, particularly in a war-fighting capacity, is truly enormous. So to our serving personnel and veterans, when I say thank you for your service, you'll know what I mean. In particular, to the few surviving veterans of World War II and the battle for Australia and their families, I say thank you for your service. Ladies and gentlemen, today, on this 82nd anniversary of the battle for Australia, I've asked you to remember our past. If it's for no other reason than just to ensure that we avoid the same tragedies in the future. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for remembering, lest we forget.